welcome, Dr. Irving. Today is our first podcast in a series of, I hope, a lot. This first podcast is with Dr. Andrew Irving, as everyone can see. We're going to talk a bit about heritage. Since it's a podcast, we're not going to have an interview, but just more of a conversation.
Sounds
and
good to
since
me.
Dr. Irving is the expert on heritage, we are going to talk a little bit about that, since it's quite relevant for one of our master tracks, and I think it's relevant in the Netherlands because there's a lot of heritage in an old country like ours. Yeah, I will just start off with the big question. What is heritage exactly? Can you explain us about that?
Well, that's the $60 million question, isn't it? So, because we're at university, we like to make simple things complicated.
Mhm.
One could start by saying, we used to think, that it was things that we could list, right? We could create a long list of monuments of old stuff, old buildings, old sites. And this really was a common practice and way of thinking about heritage in the 19th and early 20th century, I would say, up until about the 1950s.
Mhm.
And so you can see the vestiges of that in like international lists of like UNESCO World Heritage Site, right?
Yeah.
And then more recently that has expanded. So people are more interested in practices, heritage, and that might be called immaterial heritage.
Mhm.
And what that's getting at is maybe heritage isn't so much old stuff. And then when you get into a question of, is it just really, really old stuff? And is it old, pretty stuff? What old stuff? I mean, there's lots of old stuff around. The dirt is old. So what do we want to keep?
Mhm.
And as soon as we get into the question of what we're wanting to keep, we get into a question of selection. And so recent scholarship has really emphasized that heritage is a practice. It's a practice of appropriating things from the past and using them to talk about current problems, identities, and challenges. And so it's a practice, and it's also a way of talking. It's a discourse. So some scholarship really emphasizes how heritage discourse is used to garner attention for certain things. This is our heritage. We can't let this be thrown away, right? To justify certain actions, to justify expenditure, to either protest marginalization or actively to marginalize people. And so those are some of the things that we explore in our master's program, but with a particular focus on how this works in religious communities of different kinds around the world.
Okay. This is a question on the top of my head. You mentioned heritage. Well, how you mentioned it, I think of traditions as well, because
Yeah,
that's the immaterial
of course.
part of it. And we, well, I'm going to avoid that topic a bit, but we have some controversial traditions in the Netherlands that might disappear or might not disappear.
Yeah.
But some of those people really cling to those traditions,
Yeah.
as in it's our heritage. You
Yeah.
can't take it away from us. But when you look into the heritage, into the history of it, it's not that old, and it has changed all the time. Is that something that you see with a lot of immaterial heritage? That
Yes,
it's
absolutely. So you might know, or you might have come across the scholar Eric Hobsbawm, who looked a lot at what he invented the term really, the invention of tradition, right? And that's one of the things that we look at is, so why is it that certain things come to be known as traditions? And who has a vested interest in calling this a tradition? And what's at stake in defending a tradition at a particular moment in time and calling it heritage? Because one can be certain that there are winners and losers in most of these traditions. not only really controversial ones that gain media attention, but also more obscure ones. So, and it's not only the case, however, I want to emphasize that it's not only the case that traditions can work negatively to marginalize people, they can also be used creatively to resist marginalization. So there's a scholar, Laura Jane Smith, who gave examples of, say, workers in the mines in Margaret Thatcher's England and Great Britain, right? Whose whole communities and way of life that have been in place since the 19th century in the coal mines, their whole way of life revolved around the coal mines. And really, in a very short period of time, it was completely annihilated. And what those communities sort of spontaneously did was nurture their heritage, things that under normal circumstances, why is that important? Certain styles of knitting, right? And certain songs and banners to do with their unions, and heritageized that as a way of resisting annihilation, right? Of saying, we're still here, our history does still matter to us, and we want to carry it forward and pass it on, even though the minds may have gone, but our sense of identity persists, right? So that's, and focusing on practices and the way people are talking about practices, that's how we get into those interesting dialogues of power around heritage, but in outside religious communities.
And would you say that that discussion about heritage being used to marginalize or to overcome marginalization, would you say that is mostly immaterial, or are there also material things connected to that?
Oh, there's lots of material things, I think. Let me give you an example. I'm from New Zealand, and so let me give you an example from New Zealand. In the center of New Zealand's biggest city, which is Auckland, a city of I don't know, I think it's about 1.5 million people now. There's a volcanic cone, a sort of small hill that overlooks the harbors, and this was used as a fortified settlement by the indigenous people, the Maori.
Yeah.
And during the colonial conflicts in the late 19th century, there was a tree on top of this hill, and this tree was cut down by the British forces. And the tree was then replanted. A different tree was planted, a non-native species of tree that was a pine tree. So when I grew up, I knew this mountain as One Tree Hill because there's one tree on top of it, and there was an obelisk monument which praised the noble Maori race, created by the owner of the park, who was a white person.
Okay.
And then the park was given to the city. Now, in the early 2000s, a Maori activist took a chainsaw to the tree and severely damaged the tree. And there was a sort of enormous concern because this tree was really visible. It was part of the skyline of the city. And so you have people say, but it's One Tree Hill. It's our city. It's on all the postcards. We have to have the tree. And then it really brought out how much suffering this had. This was a permanent symbol of conquest, essentially, for the Maori people, and a replacement of a sacred tree planted on the site of the burial of the placenta of an important chief, replaced by a European tree. The tree was eventually removed, and the park has been, well, it was in danger of dying. It was not replaced. I think some indigenous trees have been placed on the site, and the park has been renamed. So what you get there is a complex interplay of different communities, all struggling with their past and their ways of appropriating the past and stories and vestiges, physical vestiges of the past in the present. and how can heritage both be a flashpoint for conflict and also perhaps provides a means for resolution of a conflict. It's not only a cause for conflict, it can also be an instrument for peace building, right? So that's one example I can think of, but there are many examples also in this country of similar things.
Yeah, for what course was it? I think it was. Oh, it was for the Sacred Image. For the Sacred Image, I read about a museum in New Zealand. I
Yeah,
forgot which city,
yeah,
but
yeah,
it was called Te Papa, I think,
yeah,
which means
yes,
I'm not sure what it meant, but it was something in Maori.
yeah, the land.
Um, yeah, but that seems like, or maybe it was a private organization. I'm not sure, but it seems like the New Zealand government is actively helping the Maori people to retain their heritage, or is that too much
Well,
looking into it for me?
well, it's a little bit of a rosy-eyed view, I would say. So I would say certainly biculturalism is really important, and there's an
Mhm,
important treaty between the Crown in 1840 and the Maori chiefs, and this treaty was not honoured, and so there was a long and protracted battle to get the treaty honoured, and that treaty affords the indigenous people many rights and privileges. And
mhm,
this is really through the work of protest and resistance. Really, in the 20th century, in the mid 20th century, this became more and more important on the national agenda. So I think certainly it's the case that biculturalism, certainly it's imperfect, but it's very much and clearly on the agenda of the government. So there are different issues in different countries. You know, for a colonized country, deals with different constituencies differently than, say, a settler nation like the Netherlands, right? Where you have in the Netherlands also diverse communities, some coming from former colonies,
mhm,
but also more recent ways of immigration, and how to deal with different claims of heritage. A fundamental principle of human rights and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that it's a fundamental human right, no matter who you are, or your ethnicity, or your sexual orientation, or your physical ability, your mental capacity, whatever. It's a fundamental right to be able to contribute to and to participate in heritage, cultural
mhm,
heritage. And this means, no matter where it was produced, and this means that European governments are struggling with their roles in promoting and providing access to and ensuring universal benefits for heritage
mhm.
for items not necessarily produced in their country, right?
Mhm.
Not traditionally considered Dutch, but now brought in either through colonization or through migration, now
Yeah.
in the Netherlands. That is a different problem that settler nations particularly have to deal with. Um,
Could you maybe give me a couple of Dutch examples? Because I can think of a few, but I'm not sure if they would count as heritage or not.
yeah, okay. Well, feel free to make it. What are you wondering about?
Um, well, I'm thinking of the kinds of food we have here because we have a lot
Uh-huh.
of food from Indonesia. So
Yeah, exactly.
let's say satay. That's a
Yeah,
classic Dutch dish, but it's of
yes,
course not Dutch. It's from Indonesia.
yes,
Or roti from Suriname, stuff
absolutely.
like that. Is that also part of it then?
Yes, yes, absolutely. So the heritage can be very broadly conceived. It does not have to be only the super rare and super fragile and
Mhm,
super precious that is safeguarded by national institutions, right? It can also be food practices, food
mhm,
ways, as well. And I think it's certainly the case that you have there a very complex phenomenon of um, colonization, appropriation, and then reworking mutual influence. And heritage is an interesting lens to pursue that. And what I'm interested in as a scholar is sort of standing above the heritage, right? Or not above it, but outside it a bit, and thinking critically about it. So what is at stake, for instance, if a national body were to say, satay is, Dutch heritage, what is at stake at making that claim? And who benefits from that and who doesn't benefit from it? So you can think of the 20th century as a real boom time for heritage, right? The numbers of museums and national and international listings of heritage monuments and practices has grown exponentially, and it's still growing, right? It's huge growth in heritage. This was a really rather narrow field at the late 19th century. People were beginning to develop lists of national sites. Now heritage is everywhere. And we might ask, what is that about? Why at this moment in history is there so much talk about heritage, even on a personal DNA level? If you Google heritage, what you often come across is people tracing their genetic DNA lines, right? To try to find physical traces of their past. So what is this concern with something that we call heritage? And there are lots of interesting theories about why that might be. Maybe a very fast pace of change, right? So that increased rates of obsolescence of things leads us to be sensitive to their passing and to want to preserve some things. Some scholars might more cynically say, heritage is a way, in fact, of making something irrelevant. As soon as you put it in the museum, you've said, yeah, it's nice and quaint, but we have no further use for it, right? It's like, think of that program on Dutch television, what was it? They've been recently doing it on the NPO, a list of national Dutch objects, right? That people can volunteer and they bring in to the television program, and then they evaluate whether this is something.
Oh, is it Tussen Kunst en Kitsch?
Well, it's like that. It's like a super elevated version of that.
Okay, okay.
It's that like
Oh, I think I've seen something about this. Then they talk to a curator and they explain why they think it's
why it
heritage.
should be in the
Yeah, I've seen this.
nationally symbolic of
Yes.
and it could be. There were food items there. There were all kinds of stuff, clothing,
Yeah.
right? So now one might think that's great, but is it also a way of exoticizing the past and thereby saying that has no further claim for us? Our responsibility towards it is purely to preserve one example of it, and then we can all get on with our lives, which really has nothing to do with this. And this is, in fact, I think you would see some on a cultural level. If you were a former colonized, a former colony or a descendant of former colonies, this is part of what is at stake in reclaiming issues that are now in museums, right? From Suriname or from Central Africa or wherever that are in Netherlands museums, often religious objects, right? What is at stake for the reclaiming of those objects? And that's a really hot topic now. Only last week, the minister in the Netherlands came out with a statement about repatriation of objects in the Netherlands. So it's a real, both in the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe and overseas, this is a real ongoing issue.
Yeah. What was it? So I think it wasn't in the Netherlands. I think it was something in England. I forgot what it was. I should have looked that up. But I think it's a bit tricky for me personally to be, because in my opinion, a lot of those things were in fact stolen.
Yeah.
the time period was, of course, different. So it's a bit tricky to put tags on what happened, in my opinion. But
Yes.
still, but giving things back to, well, to the people you stole it from, that seems really reasonable to me. However, this is maybe a bit controversial.
We don't shy
you
away from controversy.
um, you give it back to a culture that also changed, and
Yes.
those objects that you are giving back to them might, well, of course, it's heritage to them, um, but it's also you took something away from them, and it's now maybe part of their heritage as, oh, that's part of our history. That's a dark part of our history because we were conquered or enslaved or whatever.
Yes. Right.
And now we're getting stuff back from that period. Is that?
Yeah. No, I think, it's important to be, what's fundamental is to listen to the source communities
Mhm.
and not to oversimplify, to think, um, you know, all people in Suriname, for instance, think the same way, right?
Mhm.
To be sensitive to the complexities that they wish to articulate. But what's interesting, and I think really kind of forward thinking, in the recommendations made to the minister in the Netherlands and the recommendations that have recently been accepted, is the
Mhm.
fundamental thing is to redress the injustice. That's
Yeah.
before anything else, right?
Yeah.
And so either we recognize that something uh, uh, wrong happened and the injustice needs to be addressed,
Yeah.
or we don't, right? So the
Yeah.
so the first thing is to acknowledge the injustice and to address the injustice. And if the things are wanted back, then really that's it. The claim should be honored. Um, and so the burden of proof of justification for ongoing support or cultural significance within the host country or within the colonizing country, all of that has been really put to one side by these recommendations that are all about addressing first an injustice. Now, it'll be interesting to see how this actually works in practice, right? And this pertains first to the state-owned collections. It does not pertain, for instance, to private collections. And of
Mhm.
course, there's a large market that is ongoing in auction houses. And one of the things that I'm really interested in, for instance, in our uh, even in our own university, and a professor from our faculty was an important collector and has a very large collection,
Mhm.
it is in the University Museum's collection of anthropological objects.
Mhm.
And so one question is about ownership and should source communities be given them back? And I think that's largely being resolved by these national documents,
Mhm.
though they don't pertain particularly to our museum because it's not a state-owned collection.
Mhm.
But I think another issue is how do we handle those objects? So many museums around the world are increasingly sensitive to the religious practices and cultural practices surrounding objects. Who can handle an object? Who can see an object? What other objects can it be put next to? So if in the source community's tradition, an object cannot be handled by a certain gender
Mhm.
or cannot be stored in a certain with other objects, right? It might need to be in its own space, or it might need to receive certain ritual treatments regularly. Um, uh, some museums are increasingly saying we need to honor that. One of our ways of showing respect to the source community is that we will ourselves ensure that these practices are honored in some way by representative members of the source communities. So
Mhm.
really, some Native American museums in America have really, and Canada have really taken the lead in that issue. Also, the Te Papa Museum in New Zealand.
Mhm.
Um, uh, Increasingly, it's on the radar of European museums as well. What has first appeared on the radar is more the question of what do we need to give back? And that's partly because of the colonization history, right? That's the first thing to kind of address. And the indigenous populations are not in the neighborhood so much, right?
No.
You can understand why the issues are a bit different if you're in a settled country like the countries of North America or South America, South and Central America, the Pacific Islands, and so forth. But that's certainly a topic that I'm quite interested in here. And I know that that issue has come up in our national museums in the Netherlands, and the Volkenkundig Museum, and so forth. Really.
Would you see that for, at least for European museums? Would you see that as a sort of first step or middle ground between repatriating the objects and keeping them? Would that be something between, or is that something separate?
You know what I think is critical, and I think this applies across kind of different heritage, not just museum heritage, is dialogue. There's an important scholar called Clifford who wrote in the 1980s a really influential article about museums where he talked about them as contact zones. And there we get into heritage as a practice of learning to be in contact with each other, right? Not museums as, treasure chests or symbols of fixed symbols of national identity, or scientific research centers. Not that any of those things are exclusive necessarily, but primarily as kind of creative contact zones that bring different peoples into contact with different objects of other peoples. And what's critical, I think, in this emerging conversation and ongoing conversation about objects from former colonies is conversation between the descendants of those colonized countries and their representatives. Often, changed groups. A lot of history can have happened in the interim, and their descendants in the host country in the Netherlands, and the various parties in the Netherlands, to bring them into some sort of meaningful dialogue. And so many museums are really having to kind of, and are very active and quite inspiring ways in creating forums for dialogue, right? And you see museums playing that role more and more between different constituent members of their communities. So, for instance, to take it out of to keep it in the colonial frame, but also transform it. A major exhibition that we encountered in the Sacred Image course, that exhibition in the British Museum on Tantraism, right?
Yeah.
Brought into dialogue not only the objects themselves of various ages, medieval objects to contemporary artworks, but also the colonial history of Great Britain and its relationship to Bengal and India in the days of the British Empire, and how those images got reused and how they're being used by contemporary Bengali artists in the UK, right? As signs of resistance on various levels. So there the museum is really actively engaging with contemporary dialogue in a very productive and creative way, right? Not only dealing with 19th century history, but also its results now, and how to resolve some of those conflicts and how to creatively respond to emerging issues.
So, as I understand it, that it is, to come back to my question, if it's something separate from it is actually because it helps create the conversation that is needed to eventually give objects back, if I understand it correctly, or it helps in connecting communities and cultures, if I can say that.
Yeah, I think so, because of course, there's a fundamental issue of the redress of injustice, and that is in part to do with ownership, legal ownership,
Mhm.
but only in part. There are other redressing of justice is never just, you know, who gets to own what, but
Mhm.
that can be fundamental, and it may mean that without addressing that issue of legal ownership, there will be no justice.
Mhm.
But I would argue that the issue of justice is also broader than that. And the issue of community dialogue is much broader than what a court decrees about, you know, whether this item must go back, like the Benin
Mhm.
bronzes, for instance.
Yeah. Okay.
Really famous issue at the moment of cultural integrity. I think addressing that question is fundamental, but the question of justice is much broader than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
We've been talking for 30 minutes now. The goal was 15, but that's okay.
Yeah, well,
It was
I'm guessing there are probably bits you'll want to snip out, so that's all right.
no, I'm not
Yeah.
sure how we're going to do it. Maybe we'll make two clips
Yeah.
out of it,
Okay.
but that will be fine. I didn't think I would have so many questions popping into my head during the conversation. So
Yeah.
yeah, thank you first of all.
It's a
You
pleasure.
will be getting a small gift from us, but it's
Yeah.
kind of hard to give you that now. So we're hoping
Yeah.
that we can do that when the faculty opens up again.
Sure.
And as I said, we're probably going to post this on YouTube because this is our first podcast, and we are trying to create some content for everyone to watch in these boring times sitting at home. Yeah, I'll keep you up to date with what we are exactly going to do with the video, and I'll of course share you a link so that you can see what we did.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed it.
I very much enjoyed it. It just shows you what a kind of stimulating heritage, the stimulating topic heritage can be, right? Yeah. As soon as you start looking for it, it's everywhere, right? Yeah.
Yeah, something personal. I was planning to do the globalization master,
Yeah.
but I don't know when. But a couple of weeks ago, I also saw something about heritage, or I'm not sure how
Yeah.
I got into it. I was
Yeah.
like, maybe I should look into this as well. And with this conversation, that idea only grew in my mind. So I'm
Yeah. Good.
going to look into that.
Mission accomplished.
Yeah, maybe it has the same effect on the other viewers later on.
Yeah. I hope so, but certainly if you want to talk about that more anytime, just set up an appointment. But and some people, certainly there is some overlap. So if you're interested in issues of politics and conflict, right,
Mhm.
heritage can be an interesting lens to look at that through, right?
Mhm.
It's not that happens often around sites or buildings or objects or practices, right?
Mhm.
Of different communities, religious communities, yeah, or
Yeah.
religious and non-religious. You know, there's conflict about whether there's religious heritage should be honored at all in secular spaces. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, there's always some conflict to be found, especially with religion, it
Yes,
seems.
yeah, exactly.